week. And once again, in the news this week, we've been seeing now more than ever a spiteful rise in anti-Semitic behaviour across Australia. And as I said yesterday, it saddens me to constantly see this happening and regularly happening to people who are Australians who live in Australia. October 8 was and does remain a tragically significant day for the world as the conflict between Hamas and Israel began. Since then, it feels like there's strong hatred boiling out of people that's making them say and do things that no decent person should or would say. And at the centre of this is our Jewish community who've been rocked by all of this. It was on this very day, or on that very day, that a protest took place on the steps of the Sydney Opera House and displayed behaviour that governments at the time called abhorrent. This stuff has got to stop. I don't necessarily know what the answer is, but it absolutely has to stop. Joining me now is Alex Ryvchin. You've heard him before across the station. He's the co-chief executive officer of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry. He's on the line now. Alex, thanks for taking the time to have a chat, mate.
Thank you, Trent. Good morning.
Morning to you too, mate. You advocate for the Jewish community. I've heard you do it before. In light of what's been going on over the last few weeks, how have they reacted?
Look, we've gone through a whole range of emotions over the last nearly 2 years. You know, the months keep getting added on to this conflict and to what's happening domestically with anti-Semitism. And the community has, I think, held up incredibly well. You know, there was talk early on when you had this really rapid outburst of anti-Semitism. You referred to what happened at the Opera House steps. When you had the fire bombings, there was talk of large numbers of Jewish Australians perhaps leaving the country. That hasn't happened. And it's testament, I think, to our deep love and patriotism to Australia. We belong to Australia. We're part of this country. We've been here since the very beginning of European settlement. And we've been deeply saddened by what's transpired, but it's made us all the more determined to be Jewish and to be Australian and to try to recalibrate where this country is going, because there are things that are happening, and we hear about the major incidents, you know, what happened in Melbourne over the weekend, but on a daily basis, the abuse of Jewish children in their school uniform, what's happening on sporting fields when Jewish kids play against non-Jewish counterparts, what's happening in workplaces where Jews are being driven out of particular industries, particularly in the arts and the creative sector. These things are just totally unacceptable. But we're here and we're going to fight for our place in this country.
The attack on the Israeli restaurant that took place on the Friday, which is a Jewish day of rest, I mean, there's something in that as well, I would assume, as an observer, Alex, from the outside looking in. Are we becoming desensitised to it? I know you said the big incidents are covered, but are we becoming desensitised to it?
I think we are. I think behaviour that a few years ago would have just been utterly unacceptable, that just wouldn't have happened. I'm talking about instances, for example, of individuals being abused on public transport. When that used to happen, it almost became a national incident and people rallied behind that community that was affected. But now it's happening on such a regular basis. And one of the problems is that there are those who will always seek to minimize anti-Semitism, deny it. When abhorrent things are happening, they will say, no, it's merely political protest or it's an objection to Israel's policies. But at the end of the day, you're having Jewish Australians, proud Australian citizens, being targeted, being harmed, being affected, being pushed out. And that's really a blight on our country. You know, we can have strong views about what's happening in the Middle East. The Jewish community has strong views. We're deeply and emotionally connected to what's happening over there. But to bring the conflict here, to start attacking fellow Australians because you don't like what's happening thousands of miles away, it's not what we've been as a country, and it's not what we should be doing now.
You know, that's exactly what I was going to ask you about, Alex. I fear that we've lost touch in this country a little bit. And I'll give you an example of something I saw yesterday that made me smile. Pretty simple, but just made me smile. But I fear that we've lost touch in this country with the fact that those of us who either came here from another part of the world or whose parents or grandparents did, moved to Australia in order that this wouldn't happen in their daily life. You know, like the classic one is if your parents came here after World War II in Europe, it was because you wanted to escape the nastiness of World War II. And you didn't come here and bring that same hatred that your great-grandparents might have had if they'd lived in that life for decades before your family came to Australia. Yesterday, I was I'll get your opinion on that, whether we've lost touch with that or not. But yesterday I was walking through the CBD in Sydney, and there was a group of, it was near the town hall, there was a group of 3 or 4 people singing regular Christian songs, like pop songs, and then maybe, and talking about Jesus and the Bible. And then about 20, 30 metres down the road, there were a group of guys handing out pamphlets that had Islamic information and related to the Muslim faith. They were within 20, 30, 40, 50 metres of each other. They were getting on with their lives. Everybody was going about their day, people stopping to chat, whatever. That, to me, sums up what Australia's about. It's religious and cultural tolerance, regardless of where you came from.
Look, I agree with you entirely. On a deeply personal basis, my family came from the Soviet Union. We left as refugees in the late 80s as stateless individuals. We were taken in by Australia. We came here literally with nothing but the clothes on our backs, penniless, alone, and we had to build a new life for ourselves. And I think because of that experience, because of having come from a place of totalitarianism, of state oppression, of deprivation of individual rights and liberties, we have always cherished above all else being Australians. It has been our greatest source of pride to be welcomed in this country, to be given a fair go in this country, to be accepted and to be treated as equal, and to be judged not on where you came from or what God you pray to, but how you contribute to this country, what sort of a human being you are. And I agree with you. I think we're losing that. You know, we always had this ability for people to come to this country and bring their language and their traditions and their pastimes, but there was some commonality. We understood that we're part of a common project and a common destiny in this country. We're Australians at the end of the day. But I feel like we've fractured as a society and we've receded back into kind of clans and tribes. There's no public debate of any sort of civility or attempt to see the other side's perspective anymore. And we can talk about the factors behind that. Obviously, social media, I think, is a big part of it. It doesn't lend itself to empathy and sophisticated discussion. And you have just a lot of abuse. And the sort of abuse and hatred that begins online has now spread into the physical space, and it's a part of our society. I don't think it's merely an Australian issue. I think it's a global issue. But we have to, you know, we're responsible for what happens here, and we have to try to reconstruct ourselves as a more peaceful, tolerant place. Because we've become, I think, at our core, irrational. And maybe the pandemic and being shut in and losing our rights for a period of time contributed to it. But people are now believing stupid conspiracy theories. Yeah. They're targeting other groups. And that's always ended up very badly for the Jewish people, because the conspiracy theories and myths around us are centuries old, and whenever society starts to lose its grip a little bit, inevitably the Jews suffer for it.
Yeah, you make a good point there about tolerance and understanding. I'm speaking to Alex Ryvchin about some of the news that's been in the news this week. Alex, if you don't mind staying on the line, I want to keep talking about this. We'll take a break and we'll be right back with Alex Ryvchin. Alex, I was about to say your surname again. I realised I've been pronouncing it Ryvchin, but it's Ryvchin, isn't it?
No, it's Ryvchin.
It is Ryvchin. Okay, good. Right. Yeah. Well, with a surname like mine, mate, you can understand why I want to make sure I get the pronunciation right. Thank you. I think what I wanted to get back to, mate, in this discussion was that a lack of knowledge, I think, and understanding of what people are about and culturally what they're about, I think is at the root of this problem. Is there a way that people can easily arm themselves with information that will, because you would agree, I assume, that education and information is the easiest way to just cut through all of this silliness?
I agree with you absolutely. And I think one of the reasons why anti-Semitism has been so successful in taking root in societies is because a lot of people don't know what the Jewish people are. They don't know where we came from, what we believe. Numerically, we're tiny. So, I mean, here in a country of, you know, over 20 million, we're 110,000 people. We're minuscule. So most people probably wouldn't have met a Jew. And that enables dark actors, people with deep-held prejudice, to then manipulate society and say, this is what they are, this is what they believe, and all sorts of myths and conspiracy theories get spread in that way. I think the best thing to do is to engage with the Jewish community if that's possible, speak to people, find out what they believe and their stories and their traditions, but also, you know, beyond that, to look at culture and credible sources. I mean, the Jewish people have made enormous contributions to science, to business, to literature, to the arts. So you don't need to actually see a Jewish person or speak to one to understand them. You can understand them through their writing. There's many wonderful books and documentaries about the history of the Jewish people, about the state of Israel. And when so much information is now spread online, unfiltered, unvetted, disinformation, often spread by foreign regimes to try to distort our society, I think it makes it all the more important to have real conversations and look for credible sources.
It's easy for us who work in the media, Alex, but I find myself regularly saying to people, even within my own extended family circle, I find myself saying to people, where did you read that? Where'd you get that? You know, they'll give me an opinion on something, not this, just anything. And I'll say, where did you get that? Because that goes to what you're saying about unvetted. You know, when I open a newspaper this morning, so I open the Sydney Morning Herald, which is part of our bigger stable here at 9 Radio. I open the Sydney Morning Herald. I've got an expectation that the information has been vetted, looked at, checked, double-checked before it goes to print. But a lot of this garbage that we read online, regardless of what the subject matter, has not been checked by anybody.
Look, it's one of the biggest problems that we face, and it's an incredibly difficult challenge to overcome, and no one really has the answers for it, because increasingly this is where people get their news, their information, that's where they form opinions. And before they form a logical, kind of coherent view of a conflict or an aspect of history or contemporary society, social media gives them an emotional connection to an issue. And once you've emotionally connected to something, you've picked a side, it's very hard to dislodge that. And when you have carefully calibrated disinformation, when you have just sheer lies being spread, again, you know, to bring it back to this issue about the Jewish people, about Israel, lies about genocide, about, you know, deliberate child killing, all the sorts of things that have been said about Jews in different contexts for hundreds and hundreds of years are resurgent now. And it makes it so difficult to then unpack and challenge that, and particularly with young people. But these are the challenges we face. It's a challenge for families, for individuals, for educators, and for policymakers. It's a very difficult thing to grapple with.
Alex, last one for you, mate. For anybody who's listening, regardless of whether they're of the Jewish faith or not, they may relate to a lot of what we're talking about, or if they know anybody who feels intimidated, what would you recommend they do?
I think the key thing is always to speak up. You know, one of the great things about the Australian tradition is that we're not bystanders. We stand up for each other. We support each other. And when you see people spreading hate and lies and nonsense, particularly when you see face-to-face interactions of abuse and harassment, speak up, stand with your fellow Australians, and let's together bring this country back to what it always was, a thoroughly decent, rational, self-confident place, the envy of the world.
Alex, thank you so much for your insight and taking the time to have a chat to us this morning.
Thank you so much, Trent.